In this lecture, we talk about some of the things you want to be annotating for as you read The Handmaid's Tale, and I provide a little bit of historical context. Let's start by taking a look at the epigraph. So many novels will begin with an epigraph, a short quotation before the novel starts that gives us some clue as to the themes of the novel or what issues the novel might be exploring. Epigraph, if you break that word down, it just means outer or before writing or drawing, so outer writing, the text before the writing actually begins. And Margaret Atwood includes 3 epigraphs, 3 quotes that give us some sort of clue about what this novel might be about. So think about what these epigraphs have in common and what they might suggest about the novel. So the first one comes from the Bible, from the book of Genesis. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister, that's Leah. And she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I shall die." Then she said, "Here is my maid, Bilhah. Go to her that she may bear upon my knees, and even I may have children through her." So this is actually the passage from the Bible that the Society of Gilead uses as precedent, as justification that it's okay to have this sanctioned adultery without any pleasure just for the purposes of reproduction, because the Bible had that precedent. Actually, that precedent exists in the Bible more than once. So this is what they use as justification for their whole system of employing handmaids or using handmaids to have children for the commander's wives. It's interesting that we don't get to hear from the handmaid, Bilhah. We don't get to hear how she feels about this. She's being used as a tool here. And she's not just a surrogate, right? It's also going to be biologically her child, but for Rachel to claim as her own, for Rachel to mother and to parent. Also, as part of this is Rachel's really dramatic declaration that if she's unable to have children, she will die. Now, in a sense, if you look at that like in the long haul, I suppose that makes sense, right? If you're not able to reproduce as a species, the species will die, but it still seems rather dramatic. So built into this quote is this idea of women have an essential function. I'm not saying I agree with this, but this idea that she feels she has an essential function to bear children. And if she doesn't, she will die. So this is part of what Atwood might be critiquing, but it also is important because it serves as the justification for this bizarre system that they use in the novel The Handmaid's Tale to deal with their declining fertility rates. The next one comes from A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift. "But as to myself, having been wearied out for many years with offering vain, idle, visionary thoughts, and at length utterly despairing of success, I fortunately fell upon this proposal." So if you've read A Modest Proposal before, one of the most famous satires, it's often taught in high school classes or in college level English classes, you know that this is satirical. He's not actually suggesting that parents who are overburdened with too many children and are unable to feed themselves and their children because there's a famine, he's not actually suggesting that those parents sell their children to be eaten and raised kind of like cattle and then eaten. He's not actually suggesting that, but that is what he says in the text. But he's being satirical, right? He's joking in a very dark way. To kind of poke fun at the ridiculousness of this idea and to poke fun at how the upper classes have been thinking about and treating the lower classes who are struggling to feed their children. This comes from a Sufi proverb. So Sufism is a branch of Islam that's a more mystical, and there are some very famous Sufi poets, like Rumi is an example of a famous Sufi poet. "In the desert, there is no sign that says, 'Thou shalt not eat stones.'" So this quote has a couple negatives in it, but basically what it's saying is, in the desert, nobody has to put up a sign that says, "Don't eat the stone." At first, that might seem like kind of a bizarre proverb, but actually when you start to unpack it, you realize it makes a lot of sense. We know not to eat stones, right? It's intuitive. Of course, we're not going to eat a stone if we're starving in the desert and things look really bleak. We know it's a stone. There are certain lines that we won't cross. So you don't have to put up a sign that tells people not to eat stones. So that could be one meaning of this Sufi proverb, that some things should be so obvious to mankind. Some lines are so obviously uncrossable, right? Like eating stones because you're hungry, that you shouldn't have to say it. So it might be about these red lines that you shouldn't actually have to articulate because people should know that it's wrong. Maybe like how in the Society of Gilead, people should realize that even though the fertility rate is declining and there's a massive problem with people being unable to have children, there are still certain things that you shouldn't do, right? There are still certain lines that we shouldn't cross if we want to keep our humanity. So this one also deals with this idea of consumption, right? Not about children, but about consumption. So I think what all of these have in common is references to consuming or fulfillment of some kind, whether that's through satisfying hunger or through bearing children. Let's talk about some themes that you want to be aware of as you read the text. Remember, themes are these big picture ideas. They're not necessarily a moral. They're definitely not a plot. They're big ideas that you can extract from the text. So reproduction in children, as you can see from the epigraph, marriage and love, and in this text, those two things do not necessarily go hand in hand. Femininity and what it means to be a woman, what a woman's role is. Personal identity versus roles. Remember, the Handmaid's Tale evokes the Canterbury Tales, where each different tale teller has a different function in society, right? The reeve, the miller, the nun's priest. And the Handmaid's Tale, the title of the novel, reflects that. In fact, in the historical note at the end, there's even a reference to why the scholars who named the text chose to name it The Handmaid's Tale. Power and oppression, storytelling, reading, and language. So Offred, the narrator, is a highly literate character. She's someone who likes to pull apart words and talk about double meanings, talk about puns. And she's constantly kind of turning words over in her head and examining words and doing this meta commentary on her own narration. She also a lot of times tells the reader to be skeptical of what she's saying, or she says maybe that she remembered it differently, or maybe that she's getting some of it wrong. You could say that adds validity to her testimony, right? Because she's admitting some of her lapses in memory, and she's being reflective of that. Or it could suggest that her testimony isn't necessarily reliable. This concept of home and your sense of place. Offred has a bedroom in the house, but a door that does not lock, and she's made comfortable in certain ways, and yet it's not her home. Paying attention. There are all these references to paying attention. Offred talks about how in the former society, when it was still the United States, she did not pay attention to small changes in politics and in culture. She also talks about how she didn't pay attention to just beautiful moments in life in connection with her husband and her young daughter. And she wishes that she had paid attention, that she had noticed more. This is something you'll see over and over again throughout the text. And then, of course, the female body as a political instrument, as a tool. Some motifs and symbols you want to be aware of. Remember, a motif can be symbolic. The difference is a symbol represents something greater than it is. It stands for something else. And a motif is something that recurs throughout the text at least a couple of times, right? So a color could be symbolic, but it could also be a motif because it recurs throughout the text. Eyes. Eyes have a couple different meanings in this text, so be aware of all the references to eyes. Eggs, the color red. This idea of a palimpsest. So a palimpsest is a manuscript or a document where something was written, but then somebody came along later and scraped it off or erased it. So think about some sort of ancient document where you can still kind of see what somebody tried to write. You can still see traces of what was there. You could argue that anything is a palimpsest, right? A building that's been remodeled, that could be a palimpsest because you can see traces of how the building used to look. Gilead, the entire society in which the novel takes place, that's a palimpsest for the United States, right? You can still kind of see the traces of the United States. The very beginning, Offred is in what used to be a gymnasium of a school. And on the basketball court, she can see lines on the floor. Those lines used to mean something, right? She's in the basketball court. But now they mean something very different, right? They've been erased, but she can still kind of see them. So think about this concept of a palimpsest, not just in the literal sense, but any reference to traces of what was once there. Violence. Cambridge and Harvard. So a lot of this takes place on the campus of Harvard University, but not the Harvard that we know today. So this is Harvard, but it's become kind of the opposite of this intellectual, prestigious institution. It's something very different and something very violent. Food and cannibalism. So not literal cannibalism, but this idea of food and consumption kind of mixed in with violence is something you'll see throughout the text. And you also might want to reflect back on the epigraph, especially the second two epigraphs that deal with food and consumption. Costume. So all of the characters wear very specific uniforms or outfits. Pay attention to the color of those costumes or uniforms. Walls, we'll talk in a moment about some of the context regarding the Berlin Wall. Flowers, vessels, so whether that's a container or a chalice or the female body is a vessel, this idea of a vessel. Mirrors, and of course language and symbols. Like I mentioned before, Offred is constantly talking about language itself and breaking down and commenting on her own language and the meaning of words and how certain words have changed. Let's talk a little bit about the historical context of the novel. So Margaret Atwood wrote this in the early 1980s. Even though she is Canadian, she noticed a rise of the Christian right in the United States in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So rise in Christian fundamentalism, conservative fundamentalism in the 1970s and 1980s. In addition, there are several references throughout the text, some of them more subtle than others, to American Puritans, a theocracy based on select biblical passages. As I mentioned before, the Society of Gilead takes that biblical passage from Genesis involving Jacob and Rachel and uses it as justification for their system of reproduction and state-sanctioned adultery. This does take place in New England, or what used to have been New England. Now it's just the whole country of Gilead. And there are hints at the Salem witch trials. In fact, depending upon which edition of the book you have, you might notice a dedication to Mary Webster. Margaret Atwood may or may not have been related to Mary Webster, but the story goes that Mary Webster was an alleged witch. Whenever men would walk their horses past her house in New England centuries ago, the horses would get spooked. So the men figured that the only way they could get their horses to walk by her house was to go in and beat her savagely. And then the horses would keep walking by. Obviously a coincidence, right? And yet they decided when an important preacher of the town got ill that she must be a witch, that she must be tempted by Satan, or she must be controlled by Satan, and that she needed to be prosecuted and killed. The story goes, the legend goes, that she survived her own hanging. I don't know how that's possible, but that's how the story goes. So this dedication, or this reference to this alleged witch who was persecuted and prosecuted for being a witch, even though she wasn't one, but then who manages to survive anyway, is something that we can connect to the text and think about when we finish the text. Margaret Atwood has said that her novels aren't really sci-fi, they're more speculative fiction. That means that whereas other dystopian novels that are science fiction might talk about aliens taking over the planet or technology, robots taking over the planet, this novel is very retro, right? There isn't a lot of advanced technology in this novel at all. The people in charge in this society are very backwards looking. She also says that she doesn't really write about anything that hasn't happened in human history in some time, in some place, in some capacity. So she's using examples, not just from the United States, but from all around the world, of atrocities that really have happened. Of course, she pushes some of them to the extreme, but everything that she references here in some capacity has happened in the world. Doesn't necessarily mean that she's predicting what will happen, but it means that she's saying this could happen because all of these things have happened, but in the novel she makes them all happen in this specific time and this specific place. She may have also been thinking about the Iranian Revolution, which was a radical transformation that surprised the world, where Iran went from having a Shah favored by Americans running Iran to an Islamic theocracy. She wrote this when she was living in Berlin before the Berlin Wall was torn down. So she's talked about, and in the introduction to your book, she's talked about how walking around and having someone say, oh, this used to be something. This used to be this other building. This used to be a library before things changed, is reflected in her novel where she talks about a palimpsest, the old society versus the new society, and how things have been transformed. There's also a wall that's pretty violent in this text where bodies are hung after they are hanged and people are put to death. The bodies are hung up on the wall to scare people. So the reference to the Berlin Wall, to some sort of division, some sort of radical transformation of the society, going from a relatively open one to a relatively closed one, is something that was on her mind. Let's talk about the title. So if we look up the official definition, the dictionary definition of a handmaid, it is this: a female servant, a female slave, a subservient partner, and a housekeeper. So handmaid is an interesting choice of words, right? She could have just said, or that she could have named this particular class of people, right? That their role in the society as the breeders or the reproducers or the servants. But by naming them the handmaid, a word that has these different implications, right? Servant, slave, partner, housekeeper, she's giving us a clue as to the expectations on these women. Also, the reference to a tale. A tale is a fictitious or true narrative or story. So I think the novel would be a little bit different if it said the handmaid's story or the handmaid's narrative. Tale suggests something that could be true. It could be testimony, right? It could be actual truth. It could also be made up. It also evokes fairy tales, right? Something totally far-fetched. And when we think of a fairy tale and we think of someone wearing a hood and the color red, we probably think of Little Red Riding Hood. Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales about a group of pilgrims on a pilgrimage to the Cathedral of Canterbury. And each tale is divided according to the teller's role in society. So there's the miller's tale, the reeve's tale, the wife of Bath's tale. So the teller is given a role, right? The tale is divided according to the teller's role in society. When you make it to the historical notes, when you get to the very end of the novel and you read the historical notes, which you need to do because the historical notes are different than the historical notes in any other novel, they're actually essential to the novel itself. We learn that much later after this novel takes place, well, I won't give it away, but you're going to learn something very interesting about the name of this novel.